up to the event of the afternoon, and we're going to have a talk from a good friend of ours, Dr. Martin Griffiths. Martin has indeed been a very good friend and supporter of our U3A for many years, and it is a genuine pleasure to welcome him back once again. What shook me earlier was to learn from Martin that it was 7 years ago that he addressed us and gave us a few lectures on astronomy where he had us all stargazing. But indeed, I've aged considerably as a result of that knowledge this morning. Thank you, Martin. He is a senior lecturer in astronomy at the University of South Wales and is highly regarded nationally and internationally in his field. He is a Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society and a Fellow of the Higher Education Academy. He was also a founder member of NASA's Astrobiology Institute, Science Communication. Martin broadcasts frequently on radio and television, and he is a prolific author. He has a wealth of knowledge across a wide spectrum, and he is a most engaging speaker. So we have something to look forward, and it gives me great pleasure now to ask Martin to come forward and address the meeting. Diolch yn fawr.
Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, right. As long as I don't move from here, nothing will blow up. So we should be all right. Yeah, it's a bit odd for an astronomer to sort of talk about somebody from the past, I suppose, but I'm interested in history and I've been researching this guy for some time. It turns out he was a bit of an astronomer anyway, so I suppose it's a fair cop, it's not a bad cheat. How many people have ever heard of him? 1, 2, right, okay. How many people have heard of Howl Harris, the revivalist preacher? It's his brother. All right? It's as simple as that. The thing is, he was the older brother as well, and so obviously much of the sort of family, you know, they had a lot of interest in Joseph, but he bucked the family trend and went off to London anyway, where he became, well, rather famous in his day. But unlike so many people, he was very, very self-effacing. He wrote a number of books, never ever had his name put on them. We had to find this out by stealth much later on, and he became a government advisor as well. But we'll have a look as we go through all this. If I can get this to work. Hang on, it might help if I turn it on. And my dad, if I stood any closer. Oh, there we are, right. Okay. It works, some shape. Talgarth isn't very far away, okay? Just outside Brecon, in apparently, so I'm told, the driest valley in Wales. I don't believe that for a minute, because whenever I go there, it's always raining. But he was born in this area to Susanna and Howl Howl. So how's his name Harris? Well, they wanted to get in with the locals. And although they were farming stock themselves, they wanted to better themselves. So they changed their name to Harris because they thought it sounded more English. You work it out. Susanna and Howell, father and husband and wife, married, and the first son was born sometime around 1704 in modern reckoning. He was born in the February. And the problem is that our calendars didn't really change until 1750 anyway. And so he was born in the year 1703/1704. But when the calendar changed and everything went back to January, he was actually born in 1704. So every record that you'll find about him is actually wrong on his date of death, because it puts him as about 62 to 64, simply because they couldn't work out the calendar more than anything. He was apprenticed to become a blacksmith. That was it. That was the only thing that he was going to do for the rest of his days. Not that there was anything particularly wrong in being a blacksmith, but he was a countryman. And so he was trained by his father, who was actually a carpenter, and by a local smithy to do this kind of work. But he had quite a quest in mind, as far as we can make out. According to sort of not so contemporary accounts, but some accounts, was that he was always tinkering and making gadgets, and his mind was always far away. He got on with his contemporaries, but only so far. He wouldn't join in many of the games because he was always thinking of some ways to make a new gadget. Now, where he got this idea from, we have no idea whatsoever. But living across the way from Talgarth was Thomas Jones, the local squire, who must have taken some sort of interest in him and certainly lent him books. We know this by hearsay more than anything else, but we know that Joseph used to turn up at the house regularly, and the housemaid would let him in. He could sit in the library, and he was virtually self-taught. His mother and father could read and write, so they must have taught him to read and write. He never was schooled, despite the fact that both his brothers, his younger one, Howl and Thomas, went off to school, and he didn't. Interestingly, Howl and Thomas, rivalist preacher and tailor to the army, couldn't read a word of Greek or Latin or Hebrew, and yet Joseph could. So where did he get that schooling from when he never went anywhere that really trained him? He must have done it simply by sort of sitting there and listening to Thomas Jones more than anything. As he's grown up as a teenager, well, he began to notice things around him, and the first thing he noticed was Anne Jones, the daughter. Now, to be fair, this went down rather well with the father because he could see the potential of Joseph, but unfortunately Anne was a typical squire's daughter of her day and thought that anything to do with Joseph was totally beneath her. There was no way that she could ever contemplate even engaging this person, let alone marrying him and having his children and bringing them up. And so she rejected him. And out of this rejection, Joseph was determined to go make something of himself and kept his love for Anne going for a long, long time. It's all right, she relented in the end. It took 12 years. So having, effectively sort of letters really from Thomas Jones and a number of people in Brecon, he wanted to go off to London and have introductions to people there. But the one thing that probably got him into astronomy at an early age was a total eclipse of the sun. We're not absolutely sure that this is what got him into his particular subject, but it's rather interesting that Edmund Halley sends out a broadsheet which was, worth a penny. You had to go and buy it, but a penny, it was quite a lot of money back then, but the Harrises could afford it, and it's possible they bought this broadsheet, and then Joseph avidly took it all in. The eclipse would have been partial in Trevecca around there, but did Joseph see it? Well, as far as we can ascertain, he probably did. But if he made any record of it, and Halley was open to all comers sending records in, then there's no known note of it. But it would have piqued his interest and kept him going, no doubt. Seeing this, growing up making gadgets, falling in love with the local squire's daughter and being rejected, well, what's the only thing he can do? Well, like Dick Whittington, go off to London, make his fortune. And that's exactly what he did. But he left Anne a letter, and the letter's recently been discovered. It's not full of anything unusual, to be honest, but this is the house that Anne lived in. It's Treduston Court. And the lady who owns Treduston Court, Jennifer Moody, has recently put the place through massive refurbishment. She lives with her husband Peter in this rather huge barn-like structure on the back of it. The house has been put back as to what it would have been in the 18th century. It's cost $1 million. I don't know where they got their money from, but I'm really interested to find out where it all was. The house is rather lovely, but inside one of the walls, Anne had obviously kept this as a keepsake, and then had lost it at some time. It was found between two walls under the floorboards. And all it does is effectively say that he's off, but his unrequited love for her has got nothing to do with it. He's going to make his fortune, and one day, it would be nice if you just thought of me from time to time. Well, she must have, because they did end up getting married eventually. He was given letters of introduction to Parliament, to several MPs that were known by Robert Jones of Buckland Hall and a number of other places, or Brecon men, so they could introduce him into society. And what Robert Jones did was to take this rather interesting young man and put him in the way of this gentleman here. This is Edmund Halley, the guy who discovered the comet. He was the second astronomer royal. And so obviously whatever Joseph was doing was something that was interesting astronomically. The big question of the day is now come back to haunt us 300 years later. They wanted to find out how to discover longitude. And this year there's going to be a £10 million prize for a new scientific project. Not exactly on the same thing, but we're looking around at the moment. What Halley wanted Joseph to do was to try and figure out how to gain access to longitude, how to know how to plot a ship's course. Joseph came from Tribeca. You know, the closest he'd ever been to a ship was when he went to London for the first time. And so what Halley did was to sponsor him to finish part of his education, but he also had him apprenticed to a number of people who made scientific instruments at the time, globes, orreries, compasses, sextants or octants they would have been at the time. And when he was there with Halley, Halley took him on a nice big tour of the Greenwich Observatory and taught him how to use this instrument. This is the 8-foot quadrant. It's a mural quadrant and it's got a telescope in it, so you can have a look, sight along it, and find out the positions of stars above the horizon. Well, this would have been something that was absolutely incumbent upon anyone who was going to have a look at longitude and use the stars to work it out. Not many people at the time had that much confidence in clocks, including Joseph. So he thought that the method of looking at the stars and measuring the moon against their track would be the kind of thing. There's a colleague of mine standing against it to give you some sort of size of it. Halley was quite pleased with this instrument and in fact boasted to Joseph that it cost him £300 to put it up there. That's a lot of money really in you know, the 1730s. 1720s, 1730s. So obviously with this kind of instrumentation and the upbringing that he had, plus now his apprenticeship, Joseph, with the support of these people, was bound to do something rather original. He went off to be apprenticed to John Senex. Senex had a fantastic shop in Fleet Street, which if you've all watched Harry Potter, it's effectively like Ollivander's one shop. It's, you know, like Diagon Alley. It's full of all kinds of interesting stuff. It's no longer there, but to Joseph, this was like Aladdin's cave. He was taught how to develop scientific instruments, how to make globes, and do all kinds of things, and to use and make clocks as well. So this was quite fine precision engineering for its time. In fact, Senex was next door to Cogs, who made some of the best scientific instruments of the 18th century. And so because they were always going in and out of each other's shops, they eventually just bored a hole through the wall to save them the trouble of wandering round. And it was Joseph who sat next to this little sort of cubby hole in the wall and had access to everybody going past, pass the time of day with them, get to know the latest scientific instrument and how it could be used. One of the people that was coming back as a forwards all the time and took a great interest in Joseph was this guy. This is Honest George Graham, who was a very, very good watchmaker. And it was Graham who actually got John Harrison to also work on the longitude problem. And of course he won out in the end with his chronometers. So Joseph is now introduced to some of the best instrument makers in society, the best in the world at the time, apprenticed to them in Fleet Street, and he's got the second Astronomer Royal as a sponsor for him as well. Somebody must have thought highly of him somewhere along the line to have got in with these people so well. So while he was there working at Senex, he made a new form of compass which could be utilised by just taking it off the ship and then directing it everywhere else. But Halley, rather interested, he suggested something to him, that you should watch how the compass is made and see if you can improve upon it in any way. And what they began finding was that there were variations. in the way compasses worked. And this was due to partly their construction, but partly due to electrical currents in the atmosphere as well. And Joseph discovered, secondarily, that the currents in the atmosphere were responsible for the deviation of some compasses. So he made allowances for that kind of thing in his computations. He also made a kind of cross staff. This is a forestaff, and it's not a very good scientific instrument for its day, but it was about the best that they could do. You stick one end of it there under your eye and then point it along until you've got either the star or the sun or the moon or whatever that you know a particular latitude for against one part of the forestaff, and then that part goes on the horizon, and you can work out the angle between them and give you your latitude. It's not very good for longitude at all, but at least he was training in the use of instrumentation more than anything else. This is one of his. It's now in the Science Museum, along with a lot of stuff that's probably his, and in the Science Museum. Halley, now he's got him through this particular apprenticeship, and Joseph is not exactly chomping at the bit, but Halley says to him, well, I've got an expedition which is going out to the Caribbean. Joseph says, well, what's that got to do with me? Well, I'm not going, you are. And in 1727 he sent Joseph off to be part navigating officer, part natural historian, part astronomer on board this particular ship. It was called the Spotswood, and off he went. The Spotswood was trading in slaves, gold, anything you could pick up and anything you could steal along the way. And it had a massive ship's complement of about 300, and most of them were piratical. They were, not the kind of people that Joseph would have wanted to get in with. Nevertheless, he went all the way to Vera Cruz, and what he did while he was there was to actually use his abilities to fix the latitude and longitude of Vera Cruz. And they found that by his fixation, Vera Cruz was actually 25 miles further west than they'd originally thought, which to a ship doing a couple of knots, in a storm or, in fog, was quite a long way, isn't it? So having the reckoning to be able to do that put Joseph in the right frame of mind, and of course brought him up in the limelight of his peers as well. While he was there, he also observed a solar eclipse and did longitude calculations as well, and did all kinds of things to watch the movement of the moon and the sun, and noted them all down. He was there for probably about 15 months, and then another ship came along to bring him back home, called the Prince Frederick. Unfortunately, the Prince Frederick was absolutely full of gold that had just plundered off a Spanish ship, and Vera Cruz being in Spanish hands, they captured the ship and kept them there for 2 years. Joseph went back home on the Spotswood and avoided all this, but continued a correspondence with many of the sailors on board the other ship. So he's now found the longitude of a place, one of the first actually to be discovered outside of the United Kingdom. But it's a long way between Vera Cruz in Central America and London. So his efforts at longitude don't really bring many benefits. And when he comes back, he finds his apprenticeship is over. He can't go back to Senex's shop at all, so he's got to make a bit of a name for himself. So what he does is sit down and write a book. The book was called A Treatise of Navigation, and he was able to sell it to the Royal Navy for 6 each, which wasn't a lot of money, but it brought him in a sort of interesting income that kept him tidied over all the time. And so he stayed in with Edmund Halley, stayed at his house on many occasions. Halley then introduced him to the kind of people that Halley knew, many of whom were fellows of the Royal Society, and one person that he stayed with for a short period of time was in fact Newton, before he died. Newton didn't know much about this poor character at all, and Newton died in 1727 anyway, so it was a case of, that Joseph had known people along the way that were willing to assist him and help him along. He then comes up with a description of the use of globes and orreries, to which is prefixed, by the way of an introduction, a brief account of the solar system. You can get these off the internet if you really want to read them. Don't. It's as simple as that. Treatise of navigation, continuing everything. The interesting thing about it is that he was no different to any other scientist of his day. When you read his brief introduction to the solar system, well, it stops at Saturn. That was the end of the solar system. They didn't know anything about Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, the Kuiper Belt or anything else, or even asteroids at the time. But it's interesting, he thought that every one of them were inhabited, which was a typical representation of science at the time. Why would God have made all these worlds if they didn't have any sort of reason for being? They must all have their own inhabitants on them. And he began working alongside another person in a shop further down the street from Cogs and Sissons and everybody else and Senex, and fell in with a young instrument maker called Thomas Wright, who began to make orreries. And Joseph made a few of these and sold them on as well. And they're very, very interesting mechanical tools, effectively showing you how the Earth and the Moon turn and they go around the Sun. And of course, if you become more adept at these things, you can add all the other planets on. And you've got to have wheels and cogs and this, that and the other. As you can see with this one, you wind the handle there and the whole thing turns around in a given time. So you'd have to know a very good, sort of have a good knowledge of engineering to get through this kind of thing. But Joseph wasn't too happy doing this kind of stuff. It was stuff that he had learned as an apprentice. He was just turning money over. He wanted to get more into scientific society. And so eventually he was sent on another voyage. And this time he was to accompany a bloke called Colin McFarlane to Black River in Jamaica. And they were going to set up an observatory together, and they were going to complete Halley's catalogue of the southern stars. Unfortunately, by the time that they got there, McFarlane was, sodden with drink, liked the local girls a bit too much, and effectively wouldn't help Joseph much with the observatory at all. Joseph wasn't, in this particular case, a kind of 18th century recognised gentleman. He was the drudge who was brought along to do all the work. And so he was the one that set up the observatory with its transit telescopes, its mural quadrants, its clocks, and even Graham sent a clock along for it to work in the tropics and see how things differed in the heat in comparison to how they did here at home. So there he is, staying there. The first thing they did was to contract malaria, as every Englishman probably did at the period. And Joseph was ill for about 8 or 9 months on and off. But nevertheless, he persevered and completed the task. He was going to be there for about 2 years, but in the effect, he came back in 1.5. Using it, he set up clocks, set up a nice observatory, used a quadrant as well. And then McFarlane had some sort of, brainstorm and took the whole thing apart. Stayed there and sent Joseph home. Eventually, McFarlane returned about 5 years after he'd set out with every one of the instruments that should have been set up in this observatory to record the longitude of the place. And he sold them all to Glasgow University, where they made a rather nice observatory. But all of Joseph's work had come to nothing at this point. He had established the longitude of the Black River in Jamaica, and did particularly well, but this was never going to be something that was very useful on board a ship, plotting the points where you'd have to end up at some point along the way. So he decided to get out of London. And what he did was to apply to the Navy at Portsmouth for a navigator's job, training sailors in navigation. Unfortunately, there were people who wanted the job who had far more money than he did. And so he lost out. But while he was going for the job, he tried to put Halley's Southern Catalogue together and extended it and did rather well. Halley was very pleased with his efforts, but took the credit for it nevertheless. So poor Joseph has gone abroad twice now, did wonderful things, come back, wasn't really recognised, did a lot more donkey work and was left to his own devices yet again. One of the things he wrote up for the Royal Society was magnetic field variation across the Caribbean, which went into the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society under Edmund Halley's name. So Joseph's doing all the work and others are taking the credit for it at the same time. Nevertheless, to be fair to Halley, on 3 of the papers that he put in, he did describe all the work to Joseph. and you can still get the papers today if you want to. Magnetic field variation was something that Halley was interested in because, well, if we could find out where the magnetic field varies, or we know what its variation is, perhaps that'll be a way of determining longitude. Because if we could put the line there, and it doesn't waver about, then we could fix this longitude if we've got somebody there knowing the deviation, and then do exactly the same with every one of the field lines. And Joseph said, well, that's probably the most rubbish idea I've ever heard of, because magnetic variation is exactly what it says on the tin. It varies all the time, and therefore it wasn't a very useful thing to do. But he did record variation as he sailed around the Caribbean to show, from a scientific perspective, that Halley was incorrect to use this kind of version. But then they had a £20,000 prize up for whoever could discover longitude. So daft ideas were flourishing all the time. Have you ever heard of the powder of sympathy, which was one brought to the board by a guy called Sir Kenelm Digby? He passed the idea past Joseph, who effectively pronounced it to be utter nonsense. But nevertheless, Digby went on to the board. The powder of sympathy was quite easy in how it works. It's this strange magical powder. What you do is you take an animal, a dog, slit its paw so that it bleeds, and then you rub in the powder of sympathy, which is apparently meant to heal it. And then what you do is you leave the dog in port. How this works, I don't know. You take the bandages that the dog had around his paw on board the ship with you, and at a certain time on board the ship, say at ship's noon, you take some powder of sympathy and rub it on the bandage, and the dog would yelp wherever it was on earth. I mean, how they could even entertain an idea like this is absolutely ridiculous. And one of the board pointed out, he said, well, wouldn't it be better if the dog was on board the ship rather than the bandage? Yes, that would be a much better idea, because the dog's actually with us and he can be out, because you can, at 1 o'clock or 12 o'clock, something like that, put the stuff on. How does this work? Well, of course, they did the experiment and proved absolutely nothing at all. All they did was have a lame dog, basically. So it didn't work particularly well. Joseph was right in castigating this idea. But doing diurnal magnetic variation was really important. And of course today we've got navigational tools which sort of go beyond the boundaries of this kind of thing with satellite technology. But you know, he put them together with Halley's tables and could see that the variation was there. So what he did was to assist sailors to utilise their compasses and to recognise the variation and make allowances for it, and actually save quite a number of lives at sea by doing this too. While he was there, he watched the satellites of Jupiter and recorded their timings and transits as they went across the disk, and he was just full of all kinds of interesting stuff. He also watched a water spout and sent reports of that back as well, and he said it was quite jolly watching it, because he was watching a Spanish ship out in the bay. As the water spout got closer and closer, he noticed the Spaniards were all cowards and they jumped overboard, according to his own recollection of the thing. Well, you know, if I was one of them, I think I would have been with them as well, with this kind of thing coming towards you. But he recognised the phenomena as being an overturning of the usual sort of motion of the clouds, really, and creating a vortex in this way. The first person to actually tie together a meteorological idea with something that was had a more scientific and credible bent to it. So he comes back, doesn't get the job in Portsmouth as a navigator. Wondering what to do, he goes along to the Fleet Street offices of the Royal Society, and while he's there he becomes a sort of part-time unpaid secretary for them, sending out copies of the Royal Philosophical Transactions, meeting a number of different people, talking about navigation, astronavigation, and eventually a young person there, well, relatively middle-aged person there, called John Knight, thought, well, this guy's fantastic. I'll take him away from London and he can come and teach my children mathematics as a personal tutor. So he put the proposition to Joseph, and Joseph said, yeah, it'd be good to get outside London for a bit, and can I bring some of the instruments that I made with me, my telescope and this, that and the other, because there's going to be eclipses and things that I can teach the children. Well, John Knight said, yeah, absolutely fine, no problem at all. One of the things he wanted to take with him was a fantastically made orrery by Thomas Wright. And this really was the sort of, well, the ultimate engineering project of its day. Unfortunately, Wright had already sold it to a London collector, and the original one is now in the Science Museum. But Joseph had coveted this for some time and wanted to get to know the secrets of it so he could go and reproduce it at some point and use it as a project for him and the kids. Unfortunately, he couldn't get his hands on it. So off he went, up into Berkshire, to Gosford Hall, which was, well, John Knight's family seat. He gets there, only to find John Knight being carried out in a coffin. He died the minute he arrived. He's wondering now, is he going to have a job here? But it's okay, Wright had left behind 3 years worth of money for him to train his children. And he trained the youngest child, Nicholas, who went off to serve in India. And was a very, very good navigator. You can go to Gosford Hall today. You can have your wedding there if you really want one. It's still going, but the association with Joseph is rather interesting. Well, when the body was being dragged out, one person who was there in the house was John Conduit, who was actually married to Isaac Newton's niece. And Conduit was a man who was actually working at the Mint at the time. Knowing Joseph by repute and knowing his mathematical prowess, he thought he would make a good guy at the Mint at some point. So he developed the idea with Joseph, but Joseph said, well, look, I've got a 3-year contract here, can you wait for me? And Conduit said, well, that'll be up to the master. Well, who's the master of the Mint? Well, that's me. So you're okay, I'll wait the 3 years for you if you are willing to fulfill contractual obligations here. And that's exactly what he did. While he was at Gosford Hall, he began to put together the early parts of a book which is called A Treatise on Optics. I've got Treatise on Optics, I haven't brought it with me because it's as deadly dull and boring as Copernicus's book on geometry for the heavens, but it contains virtually everything you need to know about his own experiments on the human eye. We're very much in an Isaac Newton mode. He got a needle and stuck it behind his eye just to see what the sensation would be like and to see how his visual acuity would be changed with it. So he got to know the interior of the eye rather well and then began to utilize different lenses in different systems with different telescopes to see how they worked as well. It's a work that he never finished. He was collating and continuing to collect material for it right up until his death. But nevertheless, in 1736, he joined the Mint. He wasn't the assay master at the time, he was just an apprentice assayer. But by this time, sending all his letters home to his parents, asking how Anne was, he got his brother Howl to intercede on his behalf and said, look, I've made something of myself, I've come up in the world, I've done all right here, and now I'm in a prestigious position at the Mint. Do you think you could love me? And she took the, well, fortunately it was the kind of years when fathers would intercept the letters of their daughters. So it was a case of Thomas reads it, and he says, well, what are you waiting for? This guy is fantastic, I've told you this for many years. I think that you should marry him. So she writes back to say, yeah, I love you. And they were married in 1736 at St. Paul's on Bennett's Wharf, which is the sort of Welsh chapel of its day. Part of the stuff is still there. He goes off to work at the Mint, and of course the Mint at the time is in the Tower of London. So he becomes, effectively not a prisoner of it, but he lives in Devereux Tower, which is just there. And he and Anne have 5 children together over the next 7 years. All bar one die in very, very shortly after childbirth. The only one that was left over was Eliza Anne, who became the person who carried his line forward eventually. Work at the Mint was really exacting. How many of you can remember pounds, shillings and pence?
All of us.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so do I, all right, if it's any consolation. What Isaac Newton did was to put coinage on a gold standard. What Joseph did was to have the silver standard recognised, and for the first time in British history to bring copper coinage under a particular weights and measures system. Up until that point, there had never been any system in use. He began to standardise weights and measures. You remember stones, pounds, ounces? These are Joseph's. He was the one to standardise the entire thing, so that we know that a particular weight would be 16 ounces to a pound, 14 pounds to a stone, and then so many stone in a hundredweight, etc., etc. He was the one that did all this work at the mint, and because he was so good at it, he became the assay master, the one that was in charge of the measuring of these qualities. And so when you have a look at half a crown, the weighting on half a crown was done personally by Joseph. So if you remember using those kind of things, then you were effectively the end of a long, long line that stretched all the way back to Joseph Harris. So very, very good was he at this kind of thing, that he had the mint expanded. They began to make coinage for not just the UK, but for some European nations as well. And after the French Revolution, Jerome Lalande, who was in charge of statistics over in France, came over and begged his favour for weights and measures and this, that and the other. It's rather ironic now that we follow the French metric system when they were following the British imperial system. Such is life, innit? Joseph's probably revolving in his grave by now. But he did particularly well at the mint, and he rose eventually to become the assay master's assistant, and eventually the assay master itself. He never became master of the mint because he was not of the landed gentry. Even though Isaac Newton wasn't really of the landed gentry, he did have a farm. Joseph had none of this. Strangely, he had 3 houses though. He had a place in Lewisham, he had a place just outside what's now Hyde Park, and of course he had a place all the way back in rural Breconshire, because Thomas Jones, Anne's father, had died and left him his entire estate. So he could have become master of the mint, and we think that he was offered it, and he turned it down. And this was typical of the bloke at the time. Very self-effacing, didn't really want to be put forward. We know from records he was put forward for a fellowship of the Royal Society, and he turned that down as well. He just wanted to be recognised by history for what he had done rather than for who he was. But it goes to show exactly the sort of person that he was, because this guy is Henry Bilson Ledge, or Legger, and he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Joseph was his right-hand man in the recoinage period, in the revalidation of all the weights and measures and systems, and when they brought in all these weights and measures and new systems, he had to advise the government on how to apply them. He never mentioned a word of this to his wife. We've got this from Hansard and government records. So he became effectively a government, aid to some of the highest blokes in the land. And because of his expertise, they demanded that he write much of it down. So he went back and began to compose a new book. It got so large, he split it into 3. The books are not worth reading unless you're an economist. They're called An Essay on Money and Coins, Part 1, Part 2 and Part 3. This essay on money and coins effectively set out the economic agenda for the British Empire for the next 150 years. And it worked like a charm. He did all this completely unlettered, fairly ordinary, and just with a good knowledge of how it all worked, and simply because he had the ear of people who could guide him. If you go to the House of Lords today, Harris's essay on money and coins is one of the first things that they actually go looking for in any new economic system, to test if it works, because Harris had done it all before him. The one person, of course, who really set this train of economic thought going was this guy here, Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations. If you read The Wealth of Nations, which isn't too bad. You can get it off the internet if you want to. And then put it next to Assay on Money and Coins. He's lifted it directly from Joseph. The first 4 chapters of The Wealth of Nations is Harris's essay on Money and Coins. It's that well done. And so Adam Smith's fantastic work becomes the economic standard for everyone, but actually Harris was the one that did all the work before him and set up this economic sort of miracle of capitalism, if we can think of it that way. He's still an astronomer though, and in 1761 the one big scientific endeavour was to try and discover exactly how far away the sun was. Well, Joseph is an old man. He's not really, he's only in his 50s, but to him he was an old man. He's suffering from gout, he's still suffering from the after effects of malaria, and so he doesn't want to go on any scientific expeditions, but he still wants to watch the transit of Venus. So what he does is, goes and watches the transit of Venus, but he comes back to Wales to watch it, knowing that it's going to be crossing a meridian in Trevecca. He had to go and set up a meridian first of all. And so he comes back to where his brother Howl is running the Tiley or the Trevecca family of nonconformists, and sets up a room above the boiler house just up here. It's no longer there. Makes a hole in the roof, and over the next week he measures whenever the sun crosses over the meridian and describes arcs and lines on the floor, so you can weigh up exactly when a particular timing of noon is done. And then he confirms it with a clock. He sent 5 cartloads of instruments, most of which he never used, but one of them, a telescope, is actually still there. To set up the meridian was absolutely essential because the timing was the most accurate thing that he needed. To see when, maybe I'll go back to that, hang on. Venus was going to cross onto the sun's disk. And because he had already fixed the latitude and longitude of Trevecca very, very well, then having a local noon was very good because he knew it would be different to London's. And in fact, he worked out that the timing between Trevecca and London, between a clock showing noon in London and a clock showing noon in Trevecca, based upon his measurements of the timing of the sun crossing over the transit, was 14 minutes and 2 seconds. If you go there today, the difference is 14 minutes and 3 seconds. It's not bad for the time, is it? And that's only because he couldn't rely on his clock. So he said. So it did particularly well. The interesting thing is that the Greenwich Meridian is the time standard for the world. Wales had a meridian miles before they did to set up standard time for an astronomical inference. The meridian was so good, actually, that Howl set up a clock. And his brother sent him all the parts for the clock, all the way down from London. Joseph wasn't involved in the setting up, but Howl used it and the meridian to set local noon. And farmers from miles around would come to Trevecca to set their pocket watches and things like this, so that they would have a very good sort of go at local time. So it was used for lots and lots. The Greenwich Meridian didn't come into use for 90 years. So the Welsh beat us to it. We should really have a Trevecca Meridian, even today, shouldn't we? It would be really interesting. Here's the clock that he sent down. It's still in working order. They just, because it's a bit of a family heirloom, they don't wind it up. But it does work. And there's Joseph's telescope, which he used to watch the entire transit. They had rather interesting ways of projecting things at the time. They didn't think of projecting through the telescope and having an image on a whiteboard somewhere of this planet traversing the sun. What they did was to use a rather more interesting method where you'd look directly at the sun, but you put a jug of claret at the front of the telescope. And hopefully the sun's rays going through the jug of claret would be dimmed and you could watch it directly in this rather reddish fashion. But as Joseph found, and so did many observers at the time, was that the sunlight spoiled the claret. They couldn't drink it afterwards. So they had to find another way of doing it. When he was here and took all this, he wrote off to the Royal Society with every one of his observations and the timings and everything of it. This was sent off and it's still in the archives of the Royal Society today. Unfortunately, in Tribeca, you didn't have all 4 timings of the transit, because by the time that the sun rose, Venus was already on the disk. So you could watch only 2 timings rather than the entire 4 that was needed to work out from your position and the distance to London, the triangulation to the sun. If he'd gone somewhere else, I'm sure that he would have been able to work out the astronomical unit pretty quickly. But nevertheless, it was done. He goes back home to London, where his daughter is now 18. His wife, unfortunately, dies just before the transit measurements were made and communicated. And so he's being looked after now in the Mint, continuing his work, but now he's been given an Assay assistant to train as well. He trains him up, and in September of 1764, he dies and is buried in the Tower, in St. Peter ad Vincula, St. Peter in Chains, and his grave is still down there. Treatise of Optics was put together by friends of his, and then it was later sold, and the money contributed to the Mint workers, because that's what he wanted at the end of it. And a rather nice sort of memorial tablet is there in St. Gwendoline's Church to him and his brother Thomas, who was a bit of the rapscallion of the family, but eventually settled down, and then he made a shed load of money selling, well, tailoring materials for the army more than anything else. Howl, of course, becomes the great revivalist preacher, and their sister, Jenny, nobody ever hears of again. Just typical of the time, I suppose. But the interesting thing about it is exactly what happened to his descendants after that. So he marries Anne Jones. They have a daughter, Anna Maria, was usually called Eliza. Don't ask me why, we've never been able to find that out yet. But her real name is Anna Maria Harris. She goes back after 3 years staying at the Mint in accommodation for her till she came of age, 21, and married a distant cousin, Samuel Hughes, who was one of the landed gentry. And they had a daughter, Amelia Sophie, who eventually effectively died, and then another daughter, Eliza Ann, went on to marry Roderick Gwynn, who was the local MP living at Buckland Hall. Unfortunately, Roderick Gwynn didn't last very long. He died of a fever about 5 years after their marriage, but they had a daughter, Anna Maria Eleanor Gwynn, who went on to marry this guy, James Price Honford, and set up a rather interesting sort of aristocratic family called the Gwynn Holfords all the way along, until they get down to this guy here, Edmund Philip Herbert, and his son, Edmund Arthur Herbert. The Herbert family are the last of the Plantagenet line. So he'd actually married, or his descendants had married into what was effectively ancient royalty, more than anything else. I'll have a bit more to say about him. He marries Ethel Rogers in 1898, and they have 2 daughters, Eleanora and Mary Katherine. We won't mention Eleanora too much because, as far as I can find out, she didn't do anything, but we'll find out a little bit more about them. However, Eliza Ann, the granddaughter, who had married Roderick Gwynn, then he died, she goes to Paris to get over his death, and ends up marrying someone who was already in Paris, William Alexander Maddox. You've heard of Porthcawl, Tree Madog up in North Wales? It's him. He's the guy who set up those towns to take the slate out to various locations all around the world. They had a daughter who ended up marrying John Webb Roche. Keep his name in mind. Okay? They had a daughter and 2 sons, but unfortunately none of them really, were interested in having any further kids, and they all died without issue. So it's a bit of a shame really, because Henry Holton Palmer Vivian was actually part of the family of the Lord Vivians who ruled Swansea during the Great Copper Age. And he set up the Royal Zoological Society and the zoo in Regent's Park. So they didn't do too badly, did they? It's not bad for a little farmhand, is it? Who should have been a blacksmith and should have gone off into total obscurity. Sets up a rather interesting line which marries into royalty there. Samuel Hughes lived here at Tregunta. This is the only picture of the house that's left now, because the house was demolished. If any of you know Talgarth at all, just go up to the old psychiatric hospital. That's where the house was. So they knocked it down to build the hospital, which is a bit of a shame because it commanded quite a lot of land. And marrying into this family, they had land that stretched up into North Wales and into West Wales as well. Fortunately, he also owned Buckland Hall, which is rather interesting because Buckland Hall is where Roger Jones, the MP who took an interest in Joseph Harris when he was a young man, lived. The family owned that through the Gwyn Holfords. And the Herbert family owned this, Llansanfraid Court. It's now a hotel. But they lived here for a while until eventually after the First World War he went to Moy's Court in Chepstow, and he died there and left his daughters there as well. So coming from a rather interestingly sort of staid and typically rural background, he ends up having several country seats through his descendants. Well, his descendants do, because he doesn't enjoy them that much. This is Maureen, as she would have been called at the time. This is Mary Katherine. This is Edmund Arthur Herbert's daughter. She was born in Ireland because he was the colonel of the Inniskillen Dragoons, which he raised then and sort of sorted out through World War I. So she's Joseph's great-granddaughter, times 6. Why is she so famous? Well, she became a special operations executive agent in France. She joined the nursing auxiliary yeomanry and trained in the SOE as a spy, and was dropped into France to aid their efforts in the resistance. She was arrested by the Gestapo in 1944 and then was released because they could find no evidence against her, and she was a fluent French speaker. She'd actually been at school. She went to the Slade School of Art, took a degree in fine art, and then she went off to London University and took a degree in Arabic. But because she took a degree in Arabic, she was sent out to Warsaw just before the war, where she also picked up Polish, French, German and Italian. So she could pass as a native in so many different lands, really. Fortunately, she fell in love with Claude de Baysac, who was in the French resistance, and they had a daughter who was still alive and living in Sonoma in California and would return my calls. So I really want to tell her the story about all this. Although it says here that she committed suicide in 1983, actually that's now incorrect. She died of pneumonia at Frant in Sussex in her own house. But her daughter Claudine is still around. Now that's one side of the family. Do you remember I told you to keep an eye on John Webb Roche? Well, he's got some rather interesting relatives. No, I think you know what this one is. So as I said to John earlier at lunch, keep your eye out for this kind of thing. He's not a direct ancestor of this lady, but the family are. This would have tickled Joseph Pink that he's got a connection to the royal line, simply because he was a royalist through and through. He loved the idea of the king. In fact, George II gave him a £300 per year pension, so he liked him even more. And he highly resisted the Jacobite rebellion, and even raised money for militia on the king's behalf as well. So having this sort of rather roundabout route, not exactly into the royal family, but knowing that they're a part of that family, would have really made his day. Here it is. There's Joseph Harris there, and of course you get down to John Webb Roche, who married Eliza and had all the kids there. He's actually the cousin of Edmund Burke, who's the direct ancestor of them, but the families are still relatively close. Again, it's not bad for a blacksmith, is it? How many of us have got sort of, interesting relatives all the way along the line where you can connect yourself to royalty? Joseph would never have dreamed of this kind of thing. He never really got above his station at all, or so he thought, even though he was one of the most feted sort of people of his day, yet he kept it at a very, very low-key sort of level. So when you have a look back over his life, description and uses of the globes and ordinaries, navigation, essay on money and coins, which is now split in 3 parts. a treatise of optics, and these, which were put in the Philosophical Transactions. He made us a little bit of a mark on the world, and I went on to make a rather successively big one by redoing our coinage and our standards and weights and measures. And yet the one person that the Welsh laud more than anyone else is the religious revivalist, Howl Howl, his brother. You know, this guy was off the scale in comparison. You know, and the thing is that they didn't really see eye to eye anyway. Joseph wasn't brought up as an Anglican. In fact, he didn't particularly believe in God at all, but he came back regularly to Trevecca to assist his brother and to, you know, just give him money and, you know, sort of continue to get him to persist in preaching, even though he didn't really ascribe to his former religion at all. It must have been quite terrifying for him to sit there with his wife and his daughter, to have this guy Howl Harris ranting at him over sinfulness and death and hellfire because he lived in London. You know, which is obviously the den of iniquity that it might have been. But, you know, it would have been nice if his remains had been brought back to Trevecca, but no, they reside as effectively, you know, an assistant of royalty more than anything else in the Royal Mint, as it would have been in the Tower of London. And Trevecca has got, apart from a little museum in there with his telescope tucked into one corner, the museum is all about Howl and the revivalist preaching. But actually, if it wasn't for Joseph's money and his encouragement to his brother, he actually come home in 1736 to drag his brother to Oxford to matriculate. He matriculated and never went back. So he entered it, and that was it. When you have a look back over Joseph's life, it's quite a tale, really, isn't it? This is what we've been able to find out so far about him, that we know that he was put upon a particular government committee to end the 7 Years' War in the 18th century. So what he could have told them, I don't know, but the accounts about it are very sketchy, and we're trying to get access to the papers at the moment. The lady that lives in Thomas Jones's house is also strangely a descendant, not of Joseph, but of his assistant, a guy called Stainsby Alcon. So she's got a vested interest in trying to find out about him as well, and living in the house. He goes out to discover longitude, doesn't do it, but along the way he has a lot of fun. He discovers magnetic variation in a different place on Earth, and puts down and ascribes the limitation of compasses and other instruments on board ships at the time. He becomes a purveyor of superior instruments. In fact, he made all his own telescopes, all his own instruments, his own quadrants, his own sextants eventually as well. And apparently, they are now museum pieces. Several of them are in the Science Museum. And if I could get hold of them, I'd be really pleased to be able to do that kind of thing. His dedication to the accuracy of this kind of thing was absolutely legendary. This is what got him to be a parliamentary advisor, and he was extremely well thought of in his day. But coming back to Wales and watching the transit of Venus and setting up a standard meridian was really an interesting sort of construct as well. And I forgot about Brecon Market. His brother and the Tylee Trevecca had lots and lots of surplus from agriculture. One day, Joseph came home and he said, well, why didn't you sell it? Oh, we can't sell it. You know, what are we going to do with all the money and all that? Well, it can go towards maintaining the family. Well, where do you think we should sell it? Well, when you set up a market in Brecon. So they did. And Brecon Market is, again, thanks to Joseph Harris. Strangely, the Brecknock Agricultural Society is also one of his concerns, because he was there during the discussion when a number of gentlemen thought, why don't we set up an agricultural society? And it's one of the oldest ones in the country. So Joseph provided the initial funding for it as well. So we're beginning to find he's got his fingers in so many different pies, really. And I hope that you've enjoyed this sort of tale so far, because there's probably more to come when we got access to the records. But thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Martin Griffiths, for a fascinating topic. That was very informative. It was well illustrated, and it told us something about an amazing man who was a child in Talgath, destined to be a farmer or a blacksmith,
Either one.
but turned at the end of his day, his life left a tremendous and phenomenal impact on our world as we know it. And we are very grateful for that information. Now I shall leave the meeting open. You may have something to comment on this wonderful talk, or you may have questions for Martin. The meeting is now open for that purpose.
Can I just ask, you said Talgath, you Breton.
Yeah.
Well, funnily enough, where we were going to visit Abercamlai's house, it's just outside Talgath,
Yes, it is.
because we were there visiting it not very long ago when we went to do a recce.
It wouldn't surprise me if he had a hand in its ownership, at least through his descendants at some point, simply because someone here was owned the entire area around there. And any new building work had to be done at his behest. I don't know exactly how old Abercamlai's house is, but it goes back to the 18th century,
It goes
possibly
back a long
older.
way. And there's another house sort of just next to it, two ancient houses.
Yeah.
I can't remember the name of the other one, but Abercamlai's as well.
Yeah. We were there at, oh, hang on, let's see if I can bring it up. That house, oh, it's gone, go on, there. On the equinox this year, so we were all up very early in the morning, simply because Joseph returned home because, of course, it was his home, it was his house, with his wife, and he built a barn on the other side of it. And the barn wall is set up, one of the stones, or several of the stones, have got notches on them. And on the equinox sunrise, it goes up the notches on the side of the barn and over the hill. So he's obviously interested in the way in which, you know, astronomy was portrayed around the time, and then utilised various, not just instruments, but buildings as well, to note this kind of thing. And so we watched, unfortunately the cloud covered the sun just as it rose, so we missed the first two notches, and then the sort of wall leans out slightly as the sun climbs, and every 5 minutes it enters a notch. Very, very clever.
I'm amazed to do a research, Martin, because what's on the internet is absolutely pathetic.
It's not a lot, yeah.
Would you mind asking that question on the mic, please?
I'm just amazed at Martin's research. He's given this talk without the notice that, speaking without any notes at all. I looked briefly on the internet, and what's on the internet is absolutely pathetic.
Yeah, we're trying keeping it off the internet at the moment. There is one person, one scholar, Malcolm Jones, who has done a lot of work on Joseph, but this was in the 1920s. And what we're finding is that he wrote a rather interesting essay on him, which became the foundation for what Jenny and I began to do together. And what we found all the way along is that Malcolm Jones was so wrong that we wish we could find where he is and kill him all over again. Because it's driven us around the bend. So we've had to find out different things and go through the real structure of different records. And it's been 4 years now since we've been doing this, so we've been able to live with it on and off for a while, But the kind of things that Jenny knows, and she's very cagey with information, which is lovely, really, because she's a nice lady. And I'll say to her, "Oh, did you know this?" And she say, "Yeah, didn't I tell you that?" But I got one over on her the other day because a friend of mine in Germany, Wolfgang Steinecker, he wrote an article on, William Herschel. And he said, you know, when Herschel discovered Uranus, did you know whose maps he was using to map the heavens at the time? And I said, they were made by Senex. And he said, yes, they were. But do you know who set the maps in place in the beginning? And I said, I bet it was Joseph Harris. They said, yes. And that's another thing. Harris's maps on the heavens were used for star maps by virtually everybody in the late 18th century, and they were only reconfigured in the 1920s, and nobody had a clue that it was him. He didn't put his name on them, but he did all the celestial mapping for the UK.
Right. John.
I was absolutely fascinated, Martin, what you said about his being a precursor of Adam Smith.
Yes.
On his essay on money and coins. Because I've always found international trade, anything like that, one of the most complex things to try and understand currency as it's moved around. Is the weight of the coin, so to speak, is it related to any standard? Is it anything to do with a gold standard or anything like that?
Originally, it would have been weighted to the silver and the gold standards, and it was only changed back in the 1930s, just before the war, where they got away from the silver standard for things like, shillings and crowns and things like this. So it stood for a long, long time. They had to be particular weights that were set down by Joseph. But it's interesting what you say about currency, because what Joseph did was to actively sort of commune with several economists across Europe so that currency exchange rates could be identified and, very much like today's European monetary mechanism, set so that everyone had a fair share. The interesting thing that Joseph says at the end of Money and Coins is the one thing that will make any economy fair is the regulation of the banks.
Right, before I ask for any more questions, and time is going on, let me remind you that there will be coffee at the back of the hall at £1 a cup, so you can meet and socialise as much as you like. I'd like to meet a few of you for a chat, so beware of that. So that's it. Diolch yn fawr i chi gyd am ddod. Diolch i chi Martin am y cyfraniad, a diolch yn fawr a cymerwch gofal wrth mynd gadre. Nawr te, diolch yn fawr, dyna'r diwedd y cyfarfod yma prynawn yma. Sorry? Hey? Say it again. Dorothy wanted a translation. All I was saying was thank you all, thank Martin, and have a safe journey home.